Unanimous consent that the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
I know the senator from Kentucky and the senator from Michigan are trying to work through some differences on a potential unanimous consent request, but I've asked them if I might make a few remarks if they are not quite ready yet, and they have graciously allowed me to do so. What I wanted to talk about, Mr. President, is it is December the 6th. It's 19 days until Christmas, and the 117th Congress is quickly coming to a close. But there's a lot of work that needs to be done in the meantime. First, the National Defense Authorization Act, which I hope will be the next order of business. You know, and people ask me, what are your priorities when it comes to representing the state of Texas in the United States Senate? And I said, well, it's clear there is one priority, and that is the strength and security and safety of our nation and our way of life, to preserve and protect the peace and to protect the freedom of all Americans. And the way we do that is through the National Defense Authorization Act. It is, I believe, the most important piece of legislation that we consider each year, among other important pieces of legislation. But this is how we support our troops, how we support our military families in an all-volunteer military, how we maintain our military bases, modernize our weapon systems and airframes, and invest in the next generation of weapons. And I believe that what Ronald Reagan said, that we maintain peace through strength. And when we don't make our national defense a priority, when we neglect the most important responsibilities we have here, it sends the wrong message to our adversaries and those who would take advantage of a power vacuum left by an America that refuses to lead. But the National Defense Authorization Act is how we strengthen our relationships with old allies and forge strong partnerships with new ones. For example, as a result of the invasion of Ukraine by Vladimir Putin, now Finland and Sweden have said they want to become part of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Certainly not what Mr. Putin contemplated when he said he's invading Ukraine because he didn't want a potential NATO member on his border. Well, as a result of his blundering invasion and wrongful invasion of Ukraine, he's now going to have Finland as a NATO partner on his border with some, I believe it's roughly 800 miles of common border. But we know that this is an increasingly challenging global threat landscape, and we have to do everything we can to make sure our troops have the training and the equipment and the resources needed to counter adversaries of today and tomorrow. Given the state of the world, preserving our military readiness has never been more important. China and Russia have obviously grown more aggressive in their efforts to disrupt the global order. North Korea continues to threaten the United States and our allies with its nuclear capabilities. Iran, which is the largest state sponsor of terrorism, continues to threaten democracies in the Middle East, including our ally in Israel, and threaten not only a regional conflict, but something worse. This is a fragile time for global peace and security, and a strong National Defense Authorization Act is the principal way that we supply our military and with the resources and certainty needed for our commanders to plan for the future. But this legislation is about much more than maintaining a strong national defense. It's about empowering and supporting the men and women behind it. America's service members are volunteers, and they've made a commitment not everyone is willing to make, and join the ranks of America's heroes who've defended our country throughout our nation's history. They make sacrifices each and every day in order to keep our families safe and our nation at peace, and we owe it to them to get them the support that they need. That includes not only the training, technology, and equipment they need to do their job, but also the pay and benefits that their families depend on. In short, a strong National Defense Authorization Act is critical to the success of our service members, their families, and American security, and indeed, world peace. We simply can't neglect this important responsibility or delay it any longer. I think the majority leader, the senator from New York, has already delayed it to the point here we are backed up against Christmas with no time to spare. Congress needs to pass this annual defense authorization bill ASAP, as soon as possible. I hear the House is planning to take up the Defense Authorization Act this week, and I hope that the Senate will follow in short order. For the past 61 years in a row, 61 years, Congress has managed to overcome partisan differences and pass this legislation. I hope that will continue this year, but I'm becoming more and more concerned given the crunch that we're experiencing here 19 days before Christmas. Once we pass the Defense Authorization Bill, which I hope we will do, we have one other big item on the to-do list, and that is government funding. You may ask, how in the world did we get here? Ordinarily, in what we sometimes refer to as regular order around here, the Appropriations Committees takes up and passes at the committee level 12 appropriation bills. And these fund the entire government, from the Defense Department to transportation to foreign affairs to, well, everything that the federal government does, or border security and the like. But what has happened is that system is broken down and empowered not rank and file members of the Appropriations Committee or even rank and file members of the Senate or Congress. What's happening is this bill is being negotiated probably on the order of almost $1.7 trillion behind closed doors by the leadership, and will be then presented with a fait accompli. In other words, we'll have two choices: to vote up or down on the annual appropriation bill. It's a ridiculously and embarrassing way to do business around here. Certainly not transparent, certainly doesn't provide the American people with the information they need in order to decide whether they think we're on the right track or wrong track. So here we are, more than 2 months into the fiscal year, and last year's business is still outstanding. Our Democratic colleagues hold the majority in the House and the Senate, as well as the White House. And despite their unilateral authority to set the schedule, they have failed in some of our most basic responsibilities, and that is to advance appropriation bills before the end of the fiscal year. In September, they punted the funding deadline to December the 16th, which is just 10 days away, and it doesn't sound like much progress has been made. There's no agreement even on a top-line number, which is the first step for coming up with a funding agreement. To make matters worse, Democrats are still pushing for dramatic increases in non-defense domestic spending. Now, typically these agreements include some sort of parity between defense and non-defense spending, but the spending habits of the last 2 years by the Democratic majority along party lines has been anything but typical. First of all, our Democratic colleagues stole the taxpayer credit card and went on not one, but 2 spending sprees. First was called the American Rescue Plan, which included a long list of progressive social policy. That bill cost taxpayers $1.9 trillion. Party line vote, borrowed money that somebody's going to have to pay off someday. A few months ago, our colleagues went on a second spending spree with something called the Inflation Reduction Act, which I sometimes call the Inflation Non-Reduction Act, because it won't reduce inflation anytime soon. In fact, it includes nearly $500 billion in new spending. Now, anybody who's followed what you do when inflation is raging as it is now, there are usually two components. One is the Federal Reserve that controls monetary policy, in other words, interest rates, and they can slow down the economy. They can try to take a shot at inflation by slowing down the economy and raising interest rates. But of course, that means that the money we have to pay on all the to service the debt that we're incurring here just gets bigger and bigger. But there's a second component too when it comes to tackling inflation, and that is the fiscal side, the spending. And the reason why we still see inflation at a 40-year high is because our Democratic colleagues, on top of all the spending we had to do on COVID-19 on a bipartisan basis, have engaged in a radical spending spree of roughly $2.5 trillion. That has exacerbated the fire of inflation. And many people who are financially well off have not experienced much beyond an inconvenience. But to working families who live paycheck to paycheck, the prices they pay, not only at the pump, but at the grocery store, for housing, and everything else, has gone through the roof. And they're the ones hurting as a result of this fiscal irresponsibility. So after the last 2 years, our Democratic colleagues have spent trillions of dollars on their domestic priorities, and they made no push for parity with defense spending. They didn't couple the $128 billion for K through 12 schools with new investments in research and development. They didn't mirror the $86 billion bailout for labor unions with funding for next generation aircraft or weapons. They didn't pair the $80 billion for a supersized IRS with funding to support our troops and their families. They didn't match the $40 billion in transportation projects with funding for infrastructure updates at our military installations. And they certainly didn't couple the extensive unemployment benefits that they provided with pay raises for service members. So there's been no question of parity between defense and non-defense spending this last 2 years. They've spent trillions of dollars on domestic priorities without even entertaining the idea of more support for our national security. Now they cannot widen that gap any further. We shouldn't stand for it. And we can't shortchange America's military in order to maintain this illusion of parity. And it is nothing more than an illusion after this spending spree that our colleagues have been on for the last 2 years. I hope, finding ourselves where we are, that our colleagues are able to make some progress in the coming days and avoid another continuing resolution. Last week, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin wrote to the congressional leaders stressing the importance of a full-year government funding bill. He emphasized the negative impact of short-term funding on procurement, research and development, troop training, infrastructure projects, recruitment, and so much more. He didn't mince words in saying how critical it is to pass a regular appropriation bill, saying failure to do so will result in significant harm to our people and our programs and would cause harm to our national security and our competitiveness. So this is where we find ourselves, and it's not an accident. This is by conscious design by the congressional leaders of the Democratic Party in the House and the Senate who have said we're not going to have a regular appropriations process that's predictable and done on time and in a way that's transparent and allows the American people and rank and file members of the Congress to participate. Instead, they've said, we're going to push it all to the end of the year, backstop it against Christmas and the new Congress, and we're going to tell congressional members, you have those two choices. You can vote up or vote down, but they know that we have a responsibility to fund our military. We have a responsibility to fund our border security efforts and so much more. And so it's unlikely, highly unlikely, that Congress will fail to pass an appropriation bill and turn the lights out here in Washington, D.C. and shut down the government. And our congressional leaders know that. But they have been reckless in the way they've handled this to the point now where we have very few choices. This is not what responsible governing looks like. Our Democratic colleagues have left the most fundamental tasks of the government to the very last moment. The defense authorization bill and the government funding bills are not a surprise. These are necessary to complete each and every year. And the deadlines arrive like clockwork. But somehow, our colleagues, the leadership in the House and the Senate, our Democratic colleagues, have gotten us here by design. They understand how this place works, and they like the fact that they maintain ball control over $1.7 trillion in spending. And they use the National Defense Authorization Act to try to jam through other special interest goodies because they realize that with so few moving vehicles across the floor of the United States Congress this late in the year, that is what will happen. When you have a must-pass bill, people will look for every opportunity to put in their special project because they know that will be carried along with this must-pass legislation. So, Mr. President, inflation remains at a 40-year high. Communities across the country are dealing with increases in violent crime, and the crisis at the border is growing more challenging by the day. I can't help believe that the American people deserve better than this, and I hope the next few weeks will bring more productivity than the last few months have. And I hope that once we put the business of our national security and appropriating for the federal support of the federal government behind us, hopefully sooner rather than later, we won't repeat this same mistake year after year after year. Mr. President, I yield the floor. And I note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.